At the top of New Zealand's South Island, in the hills behind Nelson, and above all on Rangitoto Kita Tonga, D'Urville Island, there are quarries that were worked hard for something like 2.5 centuries. And then, over the course of a few generations, effectively stopped. The stone was pakohe, a metamorphosed argillite prized for its hardness and its willingness to hold an edge. In a world with no metal, it was one of the best ards materials in the country, and Maori cut it out of those hillsides on a serious scale, breaking the rock face with fire and water, and dressing it into tool blanks that travelled far beyond the district. Then, over the 1500s, that changed. Across Aotearoa, use of the early adze materials, the fine basalts, the meta-argillites like pakohe, ceased or declined sharply. The great quarries of the first settlement centuries were largely left alone. So the abandonment is real. That part was not invented, and it is not a small thing either. These were among the most heavily worked places in the country, and then they were not worked at all. Those hills genuinely did go quiet. What is wrong is everything after it. This was not a mystery. It was not sudden, and it was emphatically not done without a word. The reason those quarries fell silent is one of the best understood transformations in New Zealand's human history. A change so large, it has its own name in the archaeology, and it did not begin with stone at all. It began with the collapse of an entire way of living. And as for saying nothing, the people who lived through that change carried the memory of it forward for centuries in the only medium they used, which was not paper. One of the great traditions of the South Island maps. The very shift the archaeology describes, the movement of value from one end of the country to the other. They spoke about it constantly. We simply were not listening in the right language. To understand why a quarry closes, you have to stop looking at the quarry and look instead at the society that was using it. And around the year 1500, the society using these particular quarries was coming apart and reassembling itself into something new. The first period of Maori settlement, running from roughly 1300 to about 1500, is sometimes called the Archaic or the moa-hunter period, and both names point at the same thing. These were the founding centuries, people exploring an enormous new country, mapping its resources, moving widely, and living in significant part of an extraordinary and utterly naive fauna. Above all, the moa, giant flightless birds, some of them enormous, that had evolved with no ground predators and no useful fear of anything walking towards them. That could not last, and it did not. By around 1450, the moa were essentially gone, hunted out in a couple of centuries, along with other large species that could not withstand the arrival of an efficient predator. The consequences ran through everything. The moa-hunter camps were abandoned. Subsistence swung toward fishing and foraging, and the middens show it plainly. The proportion of fishbone and shellfish rises as the bird bone disappears. In the far south, large coastal settlements did not survive. Occupation on the south coast effectively ceased, and much of the interior was given up. And the climate turned at the same time. From about 1500, the country entered a significantly cooler phase, which pressed hardest exactly where life was already most marginal. The south, the uplands, the places where tropical crops brought from Polynesia had never been comfortable in the first place. So picture what that means for a person in that century. The largest and most reliable food source your grandparents relied on no longer exists. The weather is worsening. Whole districts your people used are no longer worth occupying. You're not living in a golden age that mysteriously stopped. You are living through a hard, generation-spanning adjustment to a country that has been permanently changed, partly by your own ancestors' success. It is worth resisting the urge to moralize about the moa, because the people who hunted them were not being reckless by the standards of any knowledge available to them. They had arrived in a country unlike anything in Polynesian experience, with a large, slow, abundant food source that behaved as though it had never met danger. Nothing in their inherited understanding of the world would have suggested such a thing could be finished within a few generations. The lesson was learned the only way it could be, afterwards. What emerged from that pressure was the culture Europeans would eventually meet, more settled, more regional, far more invested in horticulture and defended. The PA, the fortified hill settlement, becomes firmly established across the landscape. Wood carving flowers into its great tradition. New weapons develop. This is not decline. It is a society rebuilding itself around a different set of facts. Now put a quarry inside that story, and the silence explains itself. A quarry serves a way of life. The great Pakohe workings were feeding a mobile, exploring, widely travelling society that needed heavy woodworking adzes and had the range and the reason to fetch stone from the top of the South Island and distribute it enormous distances. When that mobility contracted, when settlement became more regional, when long-distance travel became rarer, when the tasks people needed tools for changed, the case for a distant premium quarry weakened at exactly the moment the effort of reaching it grew. So people did the sensible thing. In the later period, from about 1500 to 1800, the early materials gave way to others. Greywacke, ordinary, tough, and available almost everywhere in New Zealand, takes over much of the everyday work. Why haul argillite the length of the country when adequate stone lies in the nearest riverbed? And at the other end of the scale, the opposite move. Nephrite, punamu, greenstone, rising to become the supreme material of the Maori world. Notice the shape of that carefully, because it is not a single replacement of one stone by another. It is split into two directions at once. Utility work drops to local, convenient stone. Prestige work concentrates on the hardest, rarest, most labour-intensive material in the country. The middle ground, the good but not sacred adze rock hauled a long way from a specialist quarry, is precisely the category that gets squeezed out. Pakohe was in that middle ground, and that is why it fell. There is a further practical point that is easy to miss. Stone tools are durable goods, and good adzes were curated, resharpened, reworked when broken, inherited, and kept in use for a very long time. A quarry does not need to run continuously to keep a society supplied. Centuries of intensive extraction can put enough material into circulation that demand for fresh stone falls away well before anybody stops valuing what has already been made. The quiet on the hillside and the emptiness of the toolkit are not the same thing, and they need not happen at the same time. There is nothing exotic in this. It is what happens to industries when the world around them changes. A quarry is abandoned for the same sorts of reasons a factory closes, not because the knowledge vanished or the workers forgot how, but because the thing it made stopped being the best answer to the question people were actually asking. The skills did not disappear either, and this is the detail that should settle the question for good. Working punamu is much harder than working argillite. Nephrite cannot be flaked into shape. It has to be sawn, ground, drilled and polished with abrasives and water over weeks and sometimes months for a single piece. Maori mastery of that grew during exactly the centuries when the argillite quarries fell quiet. A people losing their technical capacity do not, in the same period, take up the most demanding lithic craft in their history and become superb at it. Nobody lost anything. They redirected everything, which brings us to the claim that all of this was done without a word. And this is the point at which it collapses completely. Among the traditions of the South Island is the account of Poutini, a taniwha, the guardian of Pounamu, whose story is told in versions across generations. One well-known telling comes from Tipene O'Regan of Ngāi Tahu. In it, Poutini is pursued through the sea and takes shelter in a bay at Tuhua, Mea Island, in the Bay of Plenty. There he sees a woman named Waitaiki come down to bathe, and he seizes her and carries her away across the water toward the South Island. Pursued and about to be caught, he transforms her into Pounamu and lays her in the bed of a river on the west coast. Then he escapes to sea, where he remains as Kaitiaki, the guardian of the stone. That is why the coast is called Te Tai Poutini, the tides of Poutini. Now hold that account beside the archaeology and notice what the two have in common. Tuhua is not an arbitrary island. It is the source of the country's finest obsidian, the material whose distribution defines the early centuries of settlement found across New Zealand at sites of the first 250 years. The west coast is the Pounamu country, the source of the material that supersedes it. And the archaeological record of the later period is precisely this: the movement of North Island obsidian giving way to inter-island exchange in South Island greenstone. The tradition carries a journey from one place to the other. Value leaves Tuhua and comes to rest in a west coast riverbed and stays there, guarded. That correspondence was not manufactured by anybody trying to make a point. The tradition was recorded from its own custodians. The obsidian sourcing was worked out independently by chemists matching flakes to their parent flows, and the decline of one exchange system and the rise of the other was established by archaeologists counting artifacts at excavated sites. Two entirely separate lines of evidence, one of them oral and centuries old, converge on the same movement across the same water between the same two places. This deserves care because it is a living tradition and not a puzzle box. Poutini is not a code for an economic transition, and reducing it to that would be both wrong and disrespectful. It is a sacred account concerning the origin and mana of Pounamu, held by the people whose taonga it is. But traditions of this kind do carry geography, relationship and history within them. That is part of what they are for. And here the geography is unmistakable, and it is the same geography the excavations describe. So, did anyone say anything? The names of the sources are known, the relationships to them are held. The stone itself is understood as descended from a named ancestor, with a guardian in a specific river, on a coast that bears the guardian's name to this day. That is not silence. It is a record kept for 5 centuries in a form built to outlast any document, and it is still being told today by the people whose account it is. So the answer, once assembled, is short and unglamorous and entirely satisfying. The quarries were abandoned because the moa were gone by about 1450, and a food economy collapsed with them, because the climate cooled from about 1500 and squeezed the margins, because settlement contracted, regionalized and fortified, because everyday tool needs shifted to stone that could be picked up nearby, and because the highest value in the culture migrated to a material found somewhere else entirely. Every one of those causes is documented in the evidence, and not one of them requires a mystery to hold it up. And there are two distinct ways to get this story wrong, which is worth naming because most people who get it wrong pick one or the other. The first is to treat the abandonment as sinister or inexplicable, to look at a great worked hill lying quiet and assume something must have happened to the people, that they were driven off, or vanished, or knew something. That instinct has done real damage in New Zealand because it is the doorway through which the invented pre-Maori stories always try to walk. The plain fact is that nobody vanished. The descendants of the people who cut those quarries are here, and their tribal identities and their claims to those places are matters of public record and law. The second way to get it wrong is subtler and more common among people who mean well. It is to assume that because a society did not write, it did not comment on its own history, that abandonment must have happened wordlessly. But an oral tradition is not the absence of a record. It is a different technology for carrying one, with its own rigor, its own custodians, and its own extraordinary durability. The people who kept the Poutini tradition transmitted precise geographic and cultural knowledge across roughly 500 years without a single page, and it is still accurate enough that it lines up with what excavation and chemical sourcing later found. There is a test buried in that which is worth applying generally. Before concluding that a people left no account of something, ask what form their accounts actually took and whether anyone has gone and consulted it. In New Zealand's case, the answer is that a great deal was recorded, that it is held by identifiable communities, that much of it has been published with their involvement, and that where archaeology and tradition can be compared, they frequently support one another. The record was never missing. It simply was not indexed the way a library would index it. That is the thing worth carrying away. We are extremely good at hearing records in the forms we ourselves use: ledgers, reports, dated documents. And we are careless about records kept any other way. A silence in the archive is not a silence in the world. It usually just means the speaking was done in a register that we ourselves never learned to hear. The hills above Nelson stopped ringing around 500 years ago, and the reason is written into the middens, the climate record, the tool assemblages, and the traditions of the people who made the decision. They did not leave without a word. They left an account of where the value had gone, who guards it now, and what to call that coast. And every one of those words is still in use.